Autumn, 1700 years ago, by the Weihe River, on the Wuchang Plain, a battle draws to a close. After 100 days of fighting, there will be peace between Zhuge Liang and his old rival, Sima Yi. The scene is familiar to readers of the great Chinese novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Zhuge Liang, worn out by years of endless campaigning, breathing his last, sighing that he can no longer fight the enemy. The shooting star blazing across the sky and falling into the Shu camp as night falls, and Zhuge Liang finally gives up the ghost. Dali is a small village to the east of the Wuchang Plain. Da Shichuan is a carpenter here. Age 15, elderly villagers told him that Zhuge Liang had invented something called a wooden ox and flowing horse, a kind of all-terrain vehicle that would work anywhere, no matter how rugged the roads. It was an idea that entranced the young Da Shichuan. From that day onwards, he was determined to make a wooden ox and flowing horse all of his own. Without much education, Da Shichuan could only read novels and listen to stories. He read the descriptions of the wooden ox and flowing horse in records of the Three Kingdoms with difficulty. 30 years later, after much trial and error, he finally succeeded in developing a wooden ox and flowing horse, operated by a single lever.
他怎么能把这做出来？能给这10几万大军把两能用起，这是他很生气，值得去研究去想想这个事情。
Chen Xianghua is over 80 years old. He used to be chief editor of the Documents, Journal of the National Library. Beginning in 1962, he spent 25 years writing Study of Zhuge Liang's Image. Of Chen Xianghua's masterpiece, famous historian Miao Yue remarked that though some might think that devoting 25 years and 300,000 words to this topic was a waste of time, he personally wished that all aspiring scholars would waste their time in this way.
大家都知道，一个诸葛亮的草船借箭，再一个空城计，大家人人都知道。实际上，这两个故事都不是诸葛亮，诸葛亮都没有这个计箭过，也没有在唱这个空城戏。
It's the 8th day of the 4th lunar month in Haizhou Shanxi. Right on schedule, despite the heavy rain, the Guan Yu Temple Fair gets underway. The 3 statues of Guan Yu carried through the streets were made in the Ming and Qing dynasties. Some say that this temple fair dates back to the Northern Song Dynasty, giving it a history of more than 900 years.
道也得到，一定要正好，一定要靠汉。呀，真的很棒。
50-year-old blacksmith Wang Shan is very famous in Zhouchu, Shaanxi. Many villagers have come to his shop recently because Wang Shan and his son have forged something very special, a green dragon crescent blade, the legendary weapon used by Guan Yu. Guan Yu was a man who could beat 10,000 enemies, or so the stories say. The records of the Three Kingdoms tells how, riding on his horse, he felled Yan Liang and chopped off his head right in the midst of his soldiers. But what weapon did he use in legendary feats of arms like these? The earliest records of broadswords used on battlefields date from the Tang and Song dynasties. However, there is a green dragon crescent blade in each temple of Guan Yu.
因为啥？关老爷这是武神，因为啥是只有关老爷才能配得上拿这一把青龙偃月刀。
Shenbo Jun and Tan Liang Xiao have been engaged in the study on the culture of the Three Kingdoms all their lives. In the 1980s, there was a revival of interest in the study of the classical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The pair decided that there was an urgent need for a reference book that would aid academic research in this field. In 1989, their Romance of Three Kingdoms lexicon was published.
三国演义涉及的多方面的历史知识，比如直观、地理、天文、兵器、典故等等。所以呢，针对广大的研究者和读者的需要，我和谭亮孝先生，我们决定一起来编这么一部《三国演义词典》。
Yokoyama Mitsuteru was a well-known Japanese cartoonist. His comics, based on records of the Three Kingdoms, have been serialized in magazines such as Friends of Hope for 15 years. You could say that his work has caused a mania for all things about Three Kingdoms in Japan. So far, more than 50 million copies of his comics have rolled off the presses. That means that almost every Japanese family possesses a copy. The reprint editions of his comics, based on records of the Three Kingdoms, are still selling well. Another work that has great influence on teenagers is the game Romance of the Three Kingdoms, developed by the Japanese Koei Company Limited. The game was first released in 1985, immediately becoming a hit with teenagers. As of 2016, 13 versions of this game have been released, and it remains popular with players from all over the world, including China. This is the popular Romance of the Three Kingdoms, published in 1522 in the Ming Dynasty. It's the earliest version of Romance of the Three Kingdoms discovered so far. On the first page of this book, a paragraph shows that the book was compiled by Luo Ben, based on a historical work by Chen Chao. If Chen Chao was author of Records of the Three Kingdoms, who was Luo Ben? Luo Ben, also known as Luo Guanzhong, lived more than 500 years ago during the late Yuan Dynasty and the early Ming dynasties. Sadly, details of Luo Guanzhong's life and career remain sketchy. Who was he? And how did he come to write such a brilliant work? This much can be said with some certainty. The fact that he wrote plays and stories means that he was a lettered man, a scholar of some sort. However, as a writer of popular literary works, it's unlikely that he was a high-ranking scholar official. As this Ming Dynasty painting indicates, writers of such works did not enjoy high status during the Ming Dynasty. Luo Guanzhong's birthplace also remains in doubt, some arguing that he came from Dongping in Shandong, others claiming the honor for Taiyuan in Shanxi.
尽管罗贯中只是当时的一个下层文人，平生遭际是不顺的，他没有进入官场，但是呢，他在艺术上的创造，他的成就和影响，却远远超出了同时诸多民工巨卿风云之士。一部《三国演义》就使他享有不朽的声名，完全有资格进入中国文学史乃至世界文学史不朽作家的行列。
Thanks to developments in archaeology, anthropology, and biosciences, research into the history and culture of the Three Kingdoms is no longer solely text-based. In 2013, a paper published in Journal of Human Genetics, an international academic journal, attracted the attention of the world. The paper is about the latest achievements in the research of the genetic DNA of Cao Cao's clan. The research was led by Han Sheng, a professor of history, and Li Hui, a professor of anthropology at Fudan University.
全国有多少曹姓？一调查呢，770万。我们重点查曹氏族谱，传下来110多份，全查。看他这个到底这个曹姓怎么来的，有哪些是曹操的后人的，他在今天的分布的情况怎么样？
我们后来找到8家，实际上找到了9家有曹家谱里面记载，或者有其他的文字证据记载他们是曹操后代的这个家族，结果一测发现有7家是一样的，而且他们做出来的代表的家族标记的这个 Y 染色体类型叫做 O2 星F1462这个类型，在普通的汉族里面是很罕见的。
But in DNA analysis, obtaining samples is crucial. Where did the scientists get a sample of Cao Cao's DNA? In the 1970s, 2 teeth were unearthed from the mausoleums of the Cao clan in Bochou, Anhui province. They were verified to belong to Cao Cao's granduncle, Cao Ding. The team also carried out DNA tests on this tooth, showing the presence of a rare chromosome. This proves that Cao Cao's Y chromosome is of the same type.
做曹操是一只麻雀，我们只是解剖一只麻雀，我们要打通的是用遗传生物学研究历史，要打通这条路。这条路意义在哪里呢？我们这些年一直在积极推进的，就是建立中国古民族各个民族的基因，我们要把它全部建立起来。我们要根据这么大的宏大的研究里面，我们要展示出中华民族在各个历史时期是怎么大融合、怎么形成的。
The setting sun, old willows, and Chao Chao village. A blind man is beating the drum while telling a story. Nobody cares about the right or wrong after death. All villagers are listening to the story of Tai Yong. This is a poem of Lu Yo, a poet of the Southern Song Dynasty. He described a scene of a storytelling artist telling stories to villagers. In the Northern Song Dynasty, the great poet Shu Shi wrote about storytelling in his works. He wrote that some children in town were sent to listen to stories because their families were too busy to take care of them. They felt sad when they listened to the story about Liu Bei's failure, and some even cried. But they cheered up once they heard the failure of Cao Cao.
那就是说三分，说三分就是说三国分立，也有一个著名的演员叫做霍思旧，这就说明在北宋的瓦子勾栏里面，《三国志》的故事已经成为讲史的热门话题，成为一个招牌性的节目。
此人姓刘，名备，字玄德。
In the 1980s, radio broadcasts of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, performed by famous storytelling artist Yuan Kuocheng, caused quite a stir. It was a time when there was an upsurge of interest in stories about the Three Kingdoms. Every day at noon, the story would be on air, attracting huge audiences. Back then, almost everyone in the country tuned in to listen to these stories. In Dingxian of Shanxi province, there's an ancient Shuohua performance. Every year, on the 15th day of the lunar month, villagers will wear helmets, armor, and reenact battles from more than 1,000 years ago. According to historical records, the performance was already prevalent in this area in the late 16th century. The most frequently performed show is the famous Battle of Guandu that took place in the Three Kingdoms period. "400 years after the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms was completed, with the birth of the Peking opera, stories of the Three Kingdoms entered their golden age. There's an old adage in the opera industry that goes, 3,000 stories from Tongue, 800 from Song, and countless from the Three Kingdoms. So if you see a play or opera, the chances are it's set in the Three Kingdoms period. It was during this period that stories of the Three Kingdoms came to be vividly portrayed on the stage. Full of engaging characters, these tales of loyalty, courage, and treachery deeply impressed theatergoers whenever they were performed. Soon, tales of the Three Kingdoms had a nationwide following. This is from the Peking opera play, The Ganglu Temple, sung by famous performer Ma Liang. In 1930, as soon as the record was released, it was highly praised by opera fans. But soon they noticed a mistake. The line, "His younger brother is the Marquis of Shouting," was wrong. It missed a crucial Chinese character, Han. It should have read, "His younger brother is the Ting Marquis of Hanshou." After consulting experts, Ma Liang persuaded the record company to destroy the master disc and buy back all the discs that had not been sold, taking care to scratch each one of them by himself. Though some people regretted the destruction of these legendary recordings, Ma Liang was convinced he'd done the right thing. Even the smallest mistake, so he believed, could mislead future generations.
说汉寿亭侯这样的断是不对的，它不是汉代的寿亭侯，不是这个意思。汉寿是个地名，亭侯不是爵位很高的侯，亭嘛就是比县还小的一级单位，所以汉寿这个亭的这个地方的一个侯叫侯爵。
But the error was not down to Ma Liang himself. The existing versions of Romance of the Three Kingdoms were mostly edited by Mao Zonggang and his father in the Qing Dynasty. Before being edited by them, the version had a plot in which Guan Yu kills Yan Liang and Wen Chou, which Cao Cao confers the title of Marquis of Shouting on him and gives him the official seal. But Guan Yu refuses to accept. So Cao Cao adds the Chinese character Han to his title, which Guan Yu responds with a smile, "You know what I want," and accepts the offer. This plot must have been a painstaking design of the writer, Luo Guanzhong. His purpose was to highlight Guan Yu's loyalty to Han. He used the Chinese character Han to highlight the image of Guan Yu.
这个汉啊，这个汉字代表了正统，代表了关羽对于汉室的忠心，所以有这个汉字在前面，大家很容易往这个忠心、往这个汉朝、往汉室这个方面来想。
For hundreds of years, people have accepted Luo Guanzhong's version of the story, the one in which Guan Yu remained loyal to Han and refused to surrender to Cao Cao. Thanks to that version of events and the Chinese character Han, Guan Yu has come to epitomize loyalty and uprightness. Of all the characters from the Three Kingdoms period, Guan Yu is perhaps the most iconic, a hero saint who continued to be adored by Chinese people almost 2,000 years later. In the narrow sense, the Three Kingdoms period lasted for less than 60 years, starting from the enthronement of Cao Pi, or Emperor Wen of Wei. The Three Kingdoms period in a broader sense starts from the Yellow Turban Rebellion at the end of Han Dynasty and lasted for no more than 100 years. In many people's mind, though turbulent and full of suffering, it was an age of heroes. Cao Cao, who spent his whole life battling his enemies, described that period of time with deep sorrow in his poem Marching Amid Wormwoods. Ungathered bones strew the wilderness. For thousands of miles not a rooster to be heard. 1/10 of the populace may have survived. What a heartbreaking disaster. In that century, wars, plagues, and famines devastated the economy, resulting in a sharp decline in the population.
毫厘型，它是用概括力、全景式的扫描了这场战争前后的过程。它跟我们旁观者不一样，他是亲历者，他知道整个过程发生的背景，他也知道这个结果是他不愿意看到的一个结果。也正是站在这个层面上，我们说，中兴在《古诗规》当中说，这首诗是汉末实录真实实验。
东汉末年，就是三国这一段时间，人口大幅度的减少。这个减少数字不是一般的减少，大幅度的减少，从5900多万，官方统计的5900多万，下降到不到1000万，只有700多万人口。
人口减少的这么快，那就是战争的原因嘛。战争、瘟疫、饥饿都来了，民不聊生，甚至导致人吃人，对吧？那三国时候也人吃人嘛。 对吧？反正战乱就要人吃人的。
Due to the lack of historical archives, nobody knows exactly how many people lived in China during the Three Kingdoms period. The traditional idea is that the population was around 7 million. Modern scholars, however, think differently. They believe that the population was at least 20 million. Despite the disagreement, there's no doubt that China's population was at its lowest during the Three Kingdoms period.
这段历史，我们现在的一般的传播 观念是，就是这是一段英雄辈出的时光就是出现了很多了不起的人物但是其实我们如果找到一些角度，深入到这段历史，我们就会发现其实三国的历史是中国人的一段巨大的历史悲剧。
After its publication, it didn't take long before the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms became popular among the people. In 1943, just as he was working on his book, A History of the Three Kingdoms, famous historian Luo Guanzhong remarked that Romance of the Three Kingdoms was among the best-selling books in Chinese history. Indeed, according to publishers, it still regularly tops the charts in terms of sales volume. And its appeal is not restricted to China. It's just as loved by readers in neighboring countries, especially Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Indeed, arguably, it's even more popular in these countries than its homeland. Various early versions of the novel, long lost in China, are still preserved in Japan and Korea. For example, the earliest record of popular stories of the Three Kingdoms, the predecessor of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, was not found in Chinese books, but in Nogi-Oldai, a 14th century Chinese language textbook published in Korea. It contains a story about a Korean merchant buying books in Beijing, and popular stories of the Three Kingdoms was on his book list. This is a copy of the book he was after. It was published about 700 years ago in the Yuan Dynasty. It is now preserved in the Japanese Cabinet Library. It is the only known existing copy. Romance of the Three Kingdoms entered Japan in the first half of the 17th century. In 1691, the Japanese version of the novel was published in Kyoto. It was not only the first fully translated foreign novel in Japan, but also the first translated version of the novel in the world.
三国志は日本の出版界では非常に大きなテーマの一つになっています。三国志演義の翻訳書は5、6種類も日本で出版されていますし、その中でも1972年に出版された辰馬章介先生の本は何回も翻訳を重ねていて、その辰馬先生の三国志演義を元とするような三国志に関わる本というものは全てで100万冊を超えるほど出版されているんです。
第二次世界大戦以降、日本で三国志というと長い間吉川英治の小説の三国志を指すことが多かったということがあります。で、吉川英治の三国志そのものは三国志演義をもとに出来上がっているんですけども、吉川英治自身のアレンジですね、それが非常に多く加わっている部分があります。そして特に1990年代以降において三国志という名前がついていると本やもしくは漫画なんかがすごく売れるということが確かにありまして、
Nishigakushika University in Japan has a special class which specializes in the study of Romance of the Three Kingdoms. These 6 students have been passionate about the novel since their childhood. They'll be able to read the original Chinese work in their junior and senior years in university and realize their childhood dreams. Professor Ito assigns each one the name of a character from the novel.
现在点名：张飞到，诸葛亮到，陈宫到，刘备到，孙权到，夏侯渊到。
The autumn wind, with deepening sorrow, blows from Qishan Mountain, and gloomy clouds gathered over the background of the Wusang Plain. The banners of the Shu army have lost their luster. Their drums and horns now fall silent. These lines are from the long poem Stars Fall in the Autumn Wind on Wuchang Plain, written by famous Japanese poet Bansui Doi. The poem was a set text during the Meiji period, becoming even more popular when it began to be used in songs. But while Guan Yun and Zhao Yun are favorites with Chinese readers, Zhu Guoliang, the chancellor of the Chu state, strikes a chord with the Japanese. You might even say that in Japan, Three Kingdoms fever is actually Zhu Guoliang fever.
三国志の物語の中にはたくさんの英雄人物がいます。日本人はなぜ諸葛孔明が好きなのでしょうか。私は2つの理由があると思います。一つは諸葛孔明の劉備に対する忠。もう一つの重要な理由は諸葛孔明の身の上に起こった悲劇性です。
In 227, before Zhu Guoliang set out to attack Wei, he submitted a report to Liu Shan, king of the state of Shu. He wrote, "I began as a common man, farming in my fields in Nanyang, doing what I could do to survive an age of chaos. I never had any interest in making a name for myself as a noble." From this, people get to know that Zhu Guoliang used to farm in Nanyang. Shi Cao-chu, a historian in the Eastern Qin Dynasty, wrote in his book Story of Han and Jin that Zhu Guoliang came from Dongxian County of Nanyang, around 10 kilometers west to Shanyang. The place was also known as Longzhong. Later, Nanyang became part of Hunan province, while Shanyang became part of Hubei province. Both of them have temples dedicated to Zhu Guoliang. Sadly, due to inadequacy of surviving historical records, precisely which location Zhuge Liang farmed, Nanyang or Xianyang, remains a matter of debate. In the early 19th century, during the Qing dynasty, Guo Guanzhong from Hubei became the governor of Nanyang. He admired the diligent and loyal Zhuge Liang and decided to model his life on his. Working hard for the local people, he strove to be honest and upright, just like Zhuge Liang. During his term, scholars from Henan and Hubei debated the location of Zhuge Liang's farm, citing various sources in support of their claims. Seeking to put an end to the fruitless debate, Guo Guanzhong wrote a couplet that summed up the essential issue. He was devoted to the nation, no matter which emperor he served. His fame spread over the country, no matter whether he was from Xianyang or Nanyang. Just as Liu Yuxi, the prominent Tang Dynasty poet, wrote in his famous article, an epigraph in praise of my humble home. My humble home is like the thatched hut of Zhuge Liang of Nanyang, or the pavilion of Yang Xion of western Sichuan. Confucius once said, "How could I call a room humble as long as there is a virtuous man in it?" In the view of Liu Yuxi, Zhuge Liang was a man who lived up to the very highest Confucian ideals. He was a man of moral integrity who would be a model for future generations.
南洋襄阳之争争了有几百年了，他们到底争的是什么呢？从实质上说，他们争的是对诸葛亮的敬仰和崇拜，争的是能生活在诸葛亮躬耕地上的一种荣耀，一种自豪。
A folk saying says that water margin is not for the young, and romance of the three kingdoms is not for the old. It warns the elderly people that romance of the three kingdoms is full of scheming and plotting. Well, though that's a bit of a cliché, there's no doubting that the novel has been an important source of Chinese proverbs and idioms.
中国的一些成语，其实是从三国的历史中演化而来的，譬如“老骥伏枥”、“志在千里”、“鞠躬尽瘁”、“死而后已”、“如鱼得水”。也有些是直接从《三国演义》里面来的，譬如“初出茅庐”、“万事俱备，只欠东风”、“赔了夫人又折兵”。还有一些俗谚是从三国故事中引申而来的，表达了老百姓的理解和评价。譬如三个臭皮匠顶个诸葛亮，周瑜打黄盖，一个愿打，一个愿挨。所以说，《三国演义》就像一个巨大的湖，汇集了诸多水源，融会贯通，奔流到海，一直影响到我们今天生活的点点滴滴。
These frequently heard idioms and proverbs are deeply rooted in everyone's life in China. They not only enrich the Chinese language, but have also subtly shaped the personality of the whole nation.
三国的世界，它的主要就是一个精神的世界。精神的世界啊，我自己最欣赏的就是关公的精神世界。
我还是蛮喜欢曹操这个人，
曹操他是在不管《三国志》也好，或者是《通俗演义》这个小说里面也好，其实他对人才都是非常重视的。
我最崇敬、最喜爱的人物是诸葛亮。历史人物诸葛亮本来就是那个时代公认的杰出人才。
如果没有曹操这样一个人，三国的世界会暗淡许多；没有诸葛亮，他会暗淡许多，啊，所以在三国的世界当中，可能曹操和诸葛亮是代表两极。
三国文化它属于中国传统文化里边，就是参与了塑造中国人的民族性格的这么一种文化。就是中国人为什么是现在这个样子的，我们可以从三国里头找到一些答案。
In 280, General Wang Jun of the Western Qin Dynasty led his army directly to Zhenye, capital of the state of Hu. Sun Hao, the ruler of Hu, surrendered, thus bringing the Three Kingdoms era to an end. The Yangtze River flows ever onwards, sweeping away heroes as it goes. These are the words of Su Xu, a literary giant of the Northern Song Dynasty, words that echo and linger in our ears. For thousands of years, dynasties have risen and fallen, and most have been forgotten. Even some of the longest-lasting dynasties have lapsed into obscurity. So why is it that the Three Kingdoms period, an era that lasted scarcely a century, retains such a hold on people's minds? Somehow this stretch of the long, long river that is Chinese history continues of sparkle and glitter. For many, the stories from that time are as exciting as ever, its heroes still inspiring. Just as great historian Qian Mu said, nowadays every Chinese person has some knowledge about the history of the Three Kingdoms, probably because of Luo Guanzhong's version of Romance of Three Kingdoms. But why did Luo write it in the first place? Why did the novel become so popular? It's largely because the Three Kingdoms period featured a glittering array of characters. From the brilliant yet saintly Zhu Keliang, to the loyal Guan Yu, to the unscrupulous Cao Cao. And no book is so replete with heroes. From the benevolent Liu Bei, the fearless Zhang Fei, the ever-victorious Zhou Yun, the vigorous Huang Zhong, the meritocratic Sun Quan, the heroic Zhou Yu, and the honest Lu Su. Few works feature such an inspiring cast. Though hundreds of years have passed, these names shine as brightly as they ever did.